morula through gastrulation. The development of the human body begins with a single-celled zygote. It begins to divide roughly 30 hours after fertilization. It divides into 2 cells, then 4, and so on, without really gaining any extra size. So after a few divisions, we're left with a big ball of cells that's referred to as a morula. Now, as these cells keep dividing, they eventually run out of room to get nutrition from the surface, so they're going to have morula through gastrulation. The development of the human body begins with a single-celled zygote. It begins to divide roughly 30 hours after fertilization. It divides into 2 cells, then 4, and so on, without really gaining any extra size. So after a few divisions, we're left with a big ball of cells that's referred to as a morula. Now, as these cells keep dividing, they eventually run out of room to get nutrition from the surface, so they're going to have section through the morula. And see that we have cells surrounding it and within it, but as it gets larger and larger as those cells divide, that blastocyst cavity forms to allow nutrition fluid to get to and from these dividing cells. So at this point, instead of a morula, this is now known as a blastocyst, and this is the blastocyst cavity. Now, as division keeps happening, the blastocyst cavity gets larger and larger. And one group of cells gets kind of sequestered off to one end of the blastocyst. And the very appropriately named grouping of these cells is that you have an inner cell mass, shown right here, and an outer cell mass, which is making up the periphery. Now, the outer cell mass is going to form the placenta and other related structures. We're going to kind of ignore that for the time being and focus on the inner cell mass, because this is the structure that's actually going to form the embryo and eventually the fetus. So cells from the inner cell mass, still surrounded by the outer cell mass, which we'll draw in right here, begin to subdivide a little bit. So we have cells that are still in contact with the blastocyst cavity, but the cells that are kind of sequestered away from it get very tall. And these cells, these tall cells, are known as the epiblast, right here in blue. And the cells that are in contact with the blastocyst cavity are known as the hypoblast cells. Now, important thing about these epiblast cells, these will be what forms the actual embryo. These hypoblast cells, despite being part of the inner cell mass, don't really contribute anything to the mature human being. Now we move just a little further down, and because all these cells are still dividing and all this diffusion is taking place, we need to have another cavity to supply those epiblast cells. So in addition to that early blastocyst cavity in contact with the hypoblast cells, and I'm drawing in right here, and by the way, this whole area is now known as the primitive yolk sac, magically changes names for no good reason. We have the tall epiblast cells, and as I said before, they have their own cavity, and this cavity, shown right here, is referred to as the amnion. And the amnion, despite its location right now, will eventually surround and completely encompass the developing embryo and fetus all the way up until birth. Now, what we're going to do to follow up from here is take a section right through, take the lid off the amnion, so we're looking down on those hypoblast cells, and we'll follow the next step along the way, which is called gastrulation. We've gone through the point of looking at the formation of the bilaminar embryo, which is the group name for these epiblast cells in blue and the hypoblast cells in orange, and just above them we have the amniotic cavity that we sliced open. And if we were to look down, taking the lid off of that, what we'd see is kind of an elongated little disc of epiblast cells. And as I said before, these are the cells that are actually going to form really all the structures of the developing human. And we color it in blue because that's the kind of color scheme we're going to keep in place for the next series of steps. Now what happens next is this process called gastrulation. And a lot of